now we turn to the question and answer period. And I invite all the members of the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, what you need to do is to put it into the question box. Please don't put it into the chat box, but into the Q&A box, because I'm going to have trouble keeping track of both of those at the same time. So as you're thinking of your questions, we do have one question in the Q&A box. I'll pose that one, but I also have a few of my own that I'll pose to the panelists, and we'll do our first round that way. And then by that time, I hope our audience will kick in with a few more questions. So the first question from the attendees is this one. And I think it's addressed to either Michèle or Miranda. What about increased grid integration and electricity imports to back up renewables in Germany? And the question also notes that it might take some time to establish a green hydrogen infrastructure and supply chain. So if you could note that one down. And I'm going to now add a few of my own questions. And I'll just put them all out there, and then we'll do a round for everyone to give their answers. And the first one my questions has to do with the larger economic impact of this crisis situation. I think it's been mentioned that it will have an impact on industry as well as on consumers. And I'm just wondering how you assess that. And I know there's been a lot of discussion of this, particularly in relation to Germany, which is considered the kind of economic powerhouse. And do you see this as a real threat to the economic, ability, what could you say, kind of sustainability of not only Germany, but also Europe? But furthermore, it's kind of problematic that probably this climate change transition will also require a lot of resources to develop the new technologies, the new infrastructure, coming precisely at a time when there's likely to be an economic shortfall. So if you could address that larger question. A second one, the political aspect, which I think many of you touched on, and at two levels, but I especially like to focus in on the question of EU unity, which was alluded to in Michèle's slide, in terms of the aspirations of the member states falling behind the kind of targets that the EU has put forth. And could you say a little bit about how you read that landscape in terms of EU unity? Is there a problem there? Is there a difficulty in terms of actually, other than what Michèle already mentioned, gaining the leverage that's needed both to restrict dependence on Russian energy, because we know there have been some issues with Hungary and some of the other Central East European states, which are highly dependent on Russian imports of oil. But how do you assess that whole landscape? And then finally, for Reynes, particularly the energy infrastructure, how vulnerable is it? I think everybody's kind of worried about this. You talked a lot about it and how complex it is. And you mentioned the issue of the dependence on this electrical interconnection system with Belarus and Russia on the one hand, but I'm thinking also in terms of, the recent explosions / perhaps attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline, which of course isn't functioning, but still raises the problematic possibility of vulnerability of energy infrastructure in a war situation, a war environment. So if we could I think there's meanwhile a couple more questions, and I will put those out there in the box. So I hope you're writing all these down. Oh, one of them is about the attacks on Nord Stream, and if you could address that. And the next one, which is addressed to Michèle, regarding the map that you put up of the iron and hydrogen import possibilities, and she notes in terms of it being based on data before February 2022. Could you speculate about what it might look like today and how it might change? And also specifically in terms of iron, why is this so important? And does it change the map? So if you could address those questions, I think we'll go just back in the order that we ran through originally, and we'll start with Miranda then.
All right, thanks. So I'll try to give my take on the questions. In terms of grid interconnectivity in Europe, that in fact is a theme, a topic that has been of considerable interest and concern for a couple of decades already, in part because the whole transition to a renewable energy system works much better if you have more interconnectivity, because there's always wind somewhere, there's always sunshine somewhere. And if you have good interconnectivity, then you can balance the system out and not really need this base load that was part of the old system. That said, the interconnectivity with immediate neighbors for Germany is actually pretty good. So there is a lot of electricity trade. One of the things that Germany has going for it right now is that in the last years, Germany has been a net exporter of electricity. So it's actually producing more electricity than it consumes itself. And that certainly has been something that helps a little bit with the crunch that we're in now, not in a big way, but it is certainly a plus factor. In fact, right now, Germany is bailing out France because the nuclear power plants are in trouble in France after a dry summer and some technical issues that they're going through. But your question, I think, is perhaps a larger question about interconnectivity in general, not just electric, but pipelines. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. A lot of the investments in the past were investments to build pipelines moving through Central European countries, connecting Western Europe to Russia. And not enough attention was given to other kinds of interconnectivity. So I think that's one of the big lessons of this war, that becoming too dependent on a single supplier is dangerous. And since we're trying to transition to a clean future, we need to be investing in that kind of infrastructure. Which brings me to the second point, which is the economy. Europe is, like the rest of the world, still suffering from the 2 years of the pandemic, where economic activity slowed. There were a lot of costs, healthcare costs, and lost productivity costs through that transition period, or that pandemic period. Yes, we learned some new things. We learned a lot more about how you can use digitalization, and you can perhaps save a little bit on travel. But it was an expensive 2 years. And then on top of this, you now are getting whammy after whammy. The cost of the war itself. War is expensive. The military equipment is expensive. Obviously, the loss of lives is terrible, and also an impact on the economy. Destruction of Ukraine we're running into the hundreds of billions of euros already. And you have inflation that is coming because of all of this, the restricted supplies of energy from Russia, the sanctions on Russia, the OPEC countries deciding in the last couple of days that they're going to cut back on their oil production to basically keep prices high. All of this means that not just Europe, but the rest of the world is dealing with inflation, because everything is impacted by energy prices. Your food prices are tied to your energy prices. So yes, this is going to be a hard period. But one thing we do know is that we often learn out of crises, and we often make big improvements. So if we can make it through the crisis, okay, we may come out stronger at the end. And I think maybe I won't go too much into the unity question, because I know that's an area where Michèle is spending a lot of time thinking about. I will just say that the war in the Ukraine has done more to bring Europe together than anything else in the last 20 years. And a few years ago, we were talking about Brexit and which is the next country to exit, and is Europe totally fragmented? Yes, there's fragmentation. Yes, there are different viewpoints on issues. Orban's Hungary is looking at this in different ways than other parts of Europe. But on the whole, I haven't seen this degree of unity in Europe in a long time. And I think that also speaks to Europe waking up to the importance of democracy, the values that we hold, and concerns about if we have an empire that's trying to expand to our east, what does that mean for long-term future? I'll make one last point on this and say I think it's also going to impact how Europe relates to other parts of the world as well. So dependency on China is being looked at in new ways. And I think we're going to see much more effort to bring a degree of manufacturing back to Europe as a response to the pandemic, as a response to the war, and to these whole questions of supply chains being cut off. And lastly, the attack on Nord Stream, I know it was pointed at Petra, but I just want to quickly say, one thing we're learning now in Europe is that a lot of this infrastructure that we didn't pay too much attention to from a traditional security perspective, not only pipelines, but also nuclear power plants, we never thought that countries might actually attack them. And now we're seeing attacks on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants. And I think that's raising a whole new set of issues for Europe in terms of how will we think about and how do we need to think about infrastructure in the future. Also, the new infrastructure we're developing, how safe and secure will it be from potential attacks, whether they're cyber attacks or physical attacks. So I think we're entering a new era here in terms of a lot of security and economic questions.
Yeah, well, there's so many questions to answer. Just two remarks to Rain is absolutely right. And we have to invest in distribution grids, because the more we do direct electrification means heat pumps. We need new distribution grids, because if you have so many heat pumps and electric cars, our distribution networks are not good enough. And one more point, I mean, we could have known that already, not in February, but already in August 21, because since August, September 21, Russia was reducing the gas over these terrestrial pipelines so much. And this is what I don't understand, that nobody of the gas coordination group was ringing the alarm bell. And this was when our storage was emptying. But to answer the question, the grid in Greece, was a lot of things were said already, yes. But we have enough. We could do all this. We produce a whole lot of electricity for France, as Miranda said. 2/3 of the French nuclear power plants are out of order at the moment, most of them because of a technical problem, which has to be solved and takes a lot of time to solve that in all of these nuclear plants. And then the hot weather and the hot rivers, where they have not been able to cool down. And this is actually a cause also because why our electricity prices are rising so much. So everything is interconnected. When we want to interconnect the Iberian Peninsula to the mid of Europe, there we have, and that comes to the unity question, there we have a strong opposing Macron against the MidCat new pipeline, because he doesn't want that pipeline through France. Political unity is a big issue. Yes, the first reaction were fantastic. I mean, absolutely unity. The first packages of sanction without any big discussions. But since the seventh package, Hungary drops out in some things, and a little bit, it's getting a bit more complicated. But all in all, I would also say it's a push for more unity. Even we will face now more problems with the new Italian government, maybe teaming up with Hungary, and so on. But at all, it's not a huge problem at the moment. The problem is more that people are lacking behind in energy policy, what I said, renewables, energy efficiency ambitions, and then they will lack also in implementation, and there's no way that you can really force them to do that. But we will see that. The impact on industry, a lot was said already. I just want to hint. I think that we will have a lack of gas, and the question is what happens. There's no problem for households, because the EU regulation and German regulation and all the other European regulations say first households and hospitals and vulnerable customers, and then they get the gas first, and then the industry. So the thing which will happen is that they will have to, maybe, if we are not reducing the demand, they have to shut down some industries. And the question is which ones and what cascade effects will that have? Because if you shut down the steel industry or the chemical industry or whatever, I mean, it has cascading effects. It will depend a lot on how big the gap is. Every percentage will cost us percentages in the cross-national product that can go up to 10%. And this is a severe recession for Germany. But if we can manage to get the demand more down, which is really hard, then maybe we slightly go over. Actually, 23 is not yet the problem. 24 will be a bigger problem if we cannot quickly go on with LNG terminals and get more LNG, because the storage will be absolutely empty in already February, maybe March, depends on the coldness of the winter. And then we will not have enough gas to fill it up again in the same speed we did when the whole gas was still coming. And to Amy's question, the map, yeah, it was before 24. I just put that there because the risk of dropping out of Russia from this kind of gas supply was calculated different. So for Russia, it's different, or would be different today if you would calculate that. And also, I mean, Russia was going from an autocracy to a dictatorship. So these kind of things have changed, so the map would change. The map would not change for iron. That doesn't matter. I mean, if you have green hydrogen or iron, if you calculate that, more or less it's the same, because these are only, if you have hydrogen or iron or aluminium, it's an energy carrier. And the carrier doesn't matter, but for one thing, which is when we go to regions which are dry, that means the Middle East, Northern Africa, we have the problem that we export the water with the hydrogen. It's not a lot in each ship, but it sums up. And that means they would need more plants for getting water out of the seaside, which means a lot of a loss again of energy and a lot of chemical environmental problems. So if you can use another energy carrier like iron, you get rid of that problem, because iron is there and iron would go in a circle. Therefore, our project is called Clean Circles, because you will just transport it back and forth. Actually, it looks like rusty, whatever, little particles, and you just store the iron there. And then you can, which is the good thing in iron, is you can retrofit old coal plants. You can use it like coal, just a little bit of modification, and you can fire it and you can get the energy out there, which would be a good thing for old coal regions too.
Thank you very much. Petra, do you have any comments on this round?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly pick up on the question about Nord Stream. The interesting question really here is whether energy might be securitized further, say, for example, through including it into NATO remit. And that's something that we have seen like in the early 1980s, the United States was pushing very much for it. Canada and European partners were against it. In 2008, you know, when we had the other big sort of price hike of $150 per barrel oil, it came up again, also because, of course, we had a number of newer EU member states really pushing for a more strategic approach to energy security and then including it into NATO. We had a couple of statements at that time, but, you know, whenever the price goes down again, that discussion disappears. So I am very hesitant to see how this would lead to finally NATO, for example, including something on the basis of that more strategic traditional understanding of energy security, with the exception of energy infrastructure security. And that is something that has already been sort of included in sort of 2010, 2011. And this is a classic example of, I think that we will see a lot more and also very different infrastructure weaknesses with a renewable. There's a whole different geopolitics of a renewable energy market. But on the other hand, it's also very similar. It's not new, right? A tax on tankers, which would be LNG or carrying hydrogen. closing of important choke points, or, you know, if you think of Strait of Hormuz, if you think of Strait of Taiwan, so all these kind of things, and equally attacks on pipelines. So on the one hand, I can see how this may be used to try and introduce a more securitized agenda within institutions such as NATO. On the other hand, it's also not new, and there's still the discussion about how, you know, how many actors can actually attack the way that the Nord Stream pipeline has been attacked, and so how likely will this happen elsewhere in the world? So that's kind of my response to that. I also want to very quickly say something about political unity. I know it was on the EU, but don't forget about that political unity piece for Canada as well. So when we had the discussions about, you know, there are possible LNG export facilities in the Maritimes in Canada, one of the proposal was Repsol, a rather big energy company. Another proposal was a Calgary-based, you know, mid-sized company, and essentially it was all based on the assumption that they could bring the, you know, natural gas to the Maritimes, which would mean you have to have a pipeline that goes all the way through Canada, which we know is also not something that is particularly likely if it goes through Quebec. And so there's also from the outside, people often forget the extremely federal structure of Canada when it comes to energy, and that it is not enough to go to the federal government and get all sorts of promises. You have to actually understand all the other things that are connected to it. And so this brings me to my last point. As a historian, I wish we would learn from crisis. As someone who studies the 1970s, I am not so confident about that. And it also tells you something about, you know, there are very unintended consequences. We just heard this from Reines, who said, you know, actually, it really helped the renewable transition, right? And so I think there will be many unintended consequences we don't even have on our radar yet.
Thanks very much for those insights. I don't see any more questions from the attendees, so we'll move to a last round, and I'll throw out a few more questions that you might address and then give you each 1 or 2 minutes, depending on how much time we have left. The first one is the larger geopolitical context, particularly to the east. I don't know to the extent to which any of you can address the energy situation of Ukraine and the pipelines that have flowed through Ukraine and how they're you know, what's happening with them and how Ukraine's energy situation is right now. And attached to that also the potential for linkages with Azerbaijan, the Caspian Sea region, Central Asia, which are all, you know, sort of very closely connected. Well, some of those states are closely connected to Russia, others not so much. But is that something the EU is looking toward as a potential energy source? And connected to that, should the EU totally in the future give up on any Russian energy imports? You say diversify. Does that mean keeping Russian energy in the mix in your kind of long-term view, or is that something that really should not even be considered? And on the transatlantic issue, Petra, how has this impacted Canada's climate change agenda? I'm very worried about that as a Canadian citizen, that I think the climate change impetus here is quite a lot, or support for that quite a lot more divided than in some parts of Europe. And I'm worried that this is going to represent a real setback for us in terms of our climate change agenda. So we'll do one last round. You each have about 1.5 minutes or so, maybe 2 minutes. And you can say anything you want to, in addition to addressing those questions, please, any final thoughts that you might have. And this time I'll kind of shift the order, I guess. And is there anyone who wants to start? If someone would like to, otherwise we'll go with the order we had started with.
I think what you learned, and Miranda already tackled that, is what we learned is that we have to be careful to be dependent, but also in other issues. And I think China will come in now next. And China is a completely another cup of tea. I mean, if we think we are dependent on Russia, we should look how dependent we are on China. And that will also be not an easy task to untangle some of the things. I mean, we have seen that in the pandemic. And I mean, we have to see, I mean, China is going to be in the direction that it wants to be autark. I mean, they don't want to be dependent on us. They want to export to us, but they don't want to import anymore. And when this stage is reached, we are better off in thinking before of what we can do against that. We Azerbaijan, yes, we are getting already gas, a lot of gas from, I mean, not a lot compared to that from Russia, but we are getting quite some gas from Azerbaijan, and we increased also in that direction.
Yeah, I'll just answer your question about, you know, what does it all mean for Canada and commitments to net zero, and in general, the discussion that we have. I think, yes, it's kind of fueling already existing positions, which are quite polarized, as you know, in this country already. And it will just, I think it will harden those positions. It is very easy for those who support the continuing exploration of fossil fuels to use exactly this instance to talk about how important it will be to continue doing so. However, we equally see those signals that are more coming out of the markets in the US and in Asia. So Canada is expected to open one of its first LNG export facilities in 2025. And that LNG is going to Asia and mostly Japan. But we do know that Japan will stick very sort of rigorous net zero goals onto it. So, you know, in terms of considering that the Canadian energy market is so much driven by corporate actors, they will react to those kind of incentives much more than a discourse around energy security. And so, and I think Amy, of course, Amy Verdun is still in here. I always like her observation about, you know, Canada-EU relations are normally working kind of in the background, and they're working very well. And what we see at the moment is there's a lot of noise, but that noise is really not representative of what is going on. And I would say the same in terms of climate action in this country, which doesn't mean, of course, that the actual discussion around it could become extremely acrimonious. But what is really happening on the ground is a very different kind of development. And it's not, you know, even though we don't export to the EU, but it's quite clear that the EU and also G7 has made this clear. They see a clear connection between secure access to energy and the energy transition towards renewables. They have always made that linkage, and it's really difficult to see how Canada could kind of step out of that.
Thank you very much, Petra. Miranda?
Yeah, so you've got several questions here that have to do with geopolitics, and I must say, I kind of think we're in a moment of big transition geopolitically. At the end of the Soviet era, with the transformation of Europe, we saw one big transformation. And I think what we're seeing now is going to be another very big transformation. I am skeptical that Europe will return to importing energy from Russia in any major quantities in the future, at least in the foreseeable future, since I think trust has really been lost here. And the investments being made into alternative options right now are really substantial. I think something else, it's still a little bit too early to really know, because the war could go in different directions. But it's not a given that the current Russian and Russian neighboring states, pro-Russian states, are going to remain strongly linked to one another. If the war goes in the favor of Ukraine, it is possible, for example, that you'll see transformations politically in Belarus, and it could be that you're going to see Kazakhstan distancing itself more from Russia. So it's a little too early to say, but I think these are definitely some transitions that could happen. But also what we're seeing, and we didn't really discuss it before, the sanctions on energy imports from Russia have not really hit Russia so hard yet, because the prices that we've been paying for the energy have continued to feed Russians' pockets, let's say. But at the same time, what we're seeing are shifts at knowing that the long-term import-export relations are really thawing. Russia is looking to export its gas in other regions, and China and Russia have, for example, recently signed off on the as Siberian pipeline project, Power Siberia, I think it's called. And it will not replace in a short time the amount of gas imports that have been going to Russia, but it's certainly meaning that we're starting to see some new geopolitical connections here.
I'm going to have to ask you just one more minute or half minute.
Yeah.
Even.
Yeah, one other thing that I think is interesting and gives me a little bit of hope for the future is that parallel to what's going on here in the United States, we've seen two really big transitions. And one is the infrastructure bill, which was pre-war and therefore probably not influenced by it so much, but that is a bill that is going to mean a lot of money will flow into renewable energy and new grid infrastructure and also electric mobility. And then more recently, the Inflation Reduction Bill, which could also really be called the Climate Bill or the Climate and Pharmacology Bill, which is touted as the single biggest climate bill ever passed in any country. And it too has huge amounts of funding in targeting green hydrogen, digitalization, energy efficiency improvements, renewable energy. And this means that some of the pushes that we see going on in Europe will be sort of supported by what's going on in North America here. So this gives me some hope that in fact the Russian war on the Ukraine is actually going to push us all forward, at least in the West, to do more on climate and to become more renewables and energy independent. But there's a lot of geopolitical games going on right now, and that makes it all a lot of big questions too.
This has been a wonderful panel. I want to applaud all of you. I've learned so much, and I think it's been such a far-reaching and stimulating discussion that we'll obviously be continuing. So my sincere thanks to everyone and also to members of our audience. Please hold on. We will proceed to our final panel in about 7 minutes. So you'll see a screen go up for the pause period. Please don't go away. Just go get a coffee, get a tea, whatever you want, and come back, because our next mission is to discuss where do we go now with the overall security situation in Europe, including presumably energy security, but also the broader geopolitical context. So we'll see you soon. And until then, thanks again to everybody.